Hello and welcome to The Gist, our daily show on StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale, and with me today is a distinguished panelist or visitor, if you may call it, former Foreign Secretary Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who's visiting from Pune. We're lucky to have him in Delhi. And of course, what else but India, China, and of course his recent paper on India-China relations and the road after Galwan, as he calls it, the title of the paper, is going to be our topic of discussion, which eventually will, I'm sure, broaden into many other subjects related to India and China together. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you, Nitin. Thanks.
Thank you very much for being here. So I listened to your discussion on your paper, a longish paper for Carnegie that you are a visiting fellow there, and of course your discussion with a couple of other panelists there. One of the things that stood out there was the historical perspective you brought to the paper, and from the point of view of Indian and Chinese scholars and strategic thinkers, unlike the normal practice of getting a third party US or European point of view there. So what was your basic premise of the paper? I saw 3 points you had made, if you can elaborate on that.
So Nitin, the idea of the paper was, I presumed that once the immediate problem between India and China is settled, that both governments will have to get down to thinking how to move forward. And to that extent, it would be useful to see why this situation may have developed in the first place. So I essentially took 3 angles. You could have taken more, including, for example, China's relations with Pakistan, but I chose not to do so. Right. So I looked at how the two countries made foreign policy in the first decade of the 21st century, moving on into the second decade. And then I looked at whether the strong governments that were there in both countries might have made an impact. And of course, then I dealt with the proverbial elephant in the room, which is the United States of America. And the idea was to see whether any of these 3 angles or all these 3 angles had some bearing on the deterioration in the relationship that led to the situation in 2020.
Yeah, that's a very good framework to start off with, I think. And you've spoken about 2008 being a year of inflection in a way, a kind of a landmark thing. And why did you do that?
Well, for 2 reasons. One was because that was the year of the global financial crisis, and China stepped up to the plate at a time when America and Europe were struggling to revive their own economies. China was reviving the rest of the world's economies along with hers. On our part, of course, 2008 was when the 123 nuclear deal was signed, and that was a strategic shift, as it were, in Indian foreign policy, because we had been, as somebody described it, estranged democracies for half a century. But now we were going into a partnership on perhaps one of the most sensitive subjects in international relations. So I thought 2008 was a good year to begin looking at the India-China relationship. Also because in the past 5 or 6 years, relations had improved. You had the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for the boundary question. You had an exchange of visits between the 2 prime ministers. You had a number of international meetings at which we were participating, including BRICS. And the relationship looked as if it was coming on course.
In fact, you are one of the few people in the foreign service in the past 20-30 years who has dealt with China extensively as a newcomer, as a junior officer, and then finally ambassador both to China and to Taiwan, and then finally foreign secretary. But the period that you have chosen is very interesting. You've also spoken about the rapid improvement in relationship, still based on, according to a Chinese scholar, on a lot of mistrust. I mean, how do you explain that contradiction?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, Nitin, because that quotation I took was by a Chinese ambassador to India by the name of Cheng Ruisheng, who actually was one of the most respected Chinese ambassadors in India. He was somebody whom the establishment and the strategic community looked upon as a reasonably balanced ambassador. And I felt that this statement should be given some importance.
Right.
So while the relationship was growing, the underlying trust deficit was not addressed. And one of the basic contentions of the paper is that the underlying trust deficit was because both countries did not look at each other in the same way. India thought about itself differently from how China thought about India in particular. Of course, the reverse was also true, but less so. And that is the basic contention of my paper is that is the underlying cause of the mistrust or the distrust which has to be addressed.
Does it stem from lack of understanding about each other or in-depth understanding about each other? It's certainly true of India. I mean, apart from the Foreign Service and maybe a couple of other agencies, in the Indian general strategic thinking community, I think China is not such a, I mean, now it is an important and a favorite subject, but is the scholarship not adequate?
So I would say there are two reasons. One is relating to scholarship and the other relates to politics.
Okay.
On scholarship, of course, what happened in China after the end of the Cold War was that the entire West opened up for China, as well as many other regions, the Gulf because China was importing most of our oil from there, for instance, Latin America because many resources were coming from there. And therefore, the entire scholarship shifted from the traditional subjects like India or the neighborhood to these new areas. And the scholars who dealt with India aged over time. And when they aged over time, they didn't realize that India was also changing, particularly in the 90s after the nuclear tests, after Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms, after Prime Minister Vajpayee's foreign policy initiatives, including the opening to the United States. And they didn't understand, for instance, that our capacity to withstand economic sanctions after the nuclear tests was a new resilient India. They continue to focus on caste, gender, social divisions, economic weaknesses, coalition governments, which was not perhaps a proper assessment of India. But equally, politics also played a role. We approached each other fundamentally from different angles from the time of the establishment of the two countries.
Right.
So you have Nehru saying in 1946 at Shanti Niketan that without China and India, there will not be an Asian resurgence. He saw a partnership. But you have Mao Zedong in 1945 saying when the Japanese are defeated, China will shape and become the mainstay of Asia. So Mao looked at China as an exclusive single power which would basically shape Asia. India or Jawaharlal Nehru looked at it as two in partnership. And it is from that point, I suspect, that the divergence began, where we continued to give a certain prominence to China as a major power,
right,
irrespective of the fact that we did not have good relations with them. Whereas China consistently never gave India an equal status. It always considered India to be attached to some other major power.
Right. So basically, we didn't figure, so India didn't figure in their equation or their calculation or their policy formulation for a long time.
Yeah, correct.
Even post 2010, in the last decade, now we are in the new decade, while the commercial trade ties or at least the trade volumes increased, and I think Chinese got a free pass in many ways in Indian market and otherwise, India did not keep pace with what should have been done with China, I suppose. That's my assumption. But is it also true that Xi Jinping, after he became the supreme leader in China, also changed China's approach of biding time, being patient, building capacities, what Deng had said famously? He has changed that, and that also plays into how China deals with its neighbors, including India.
True. Well, actually the shift began before Xi Jinping formally became the president. This happened roughly around 2008 or 9. But by then Xi Jinping was already the heir apparent, if you want to use that word, and therefore had an input in foreign policy. So we can presume that when they moved from Deng's foreign policy of biding your time and lying low to the new policy of going out in the world and creating influence, Xi Jinping had some role in that. Of course, once he became the president, then he gave practical effect to that policy. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, or what was called One Belt, One Road, is the symbol of that outward movement of China.
That's his signature project.
That's his signature project. And because perhaps they had not factored India into the equation, they did not perhaps also factor in the possible response When it came, of course, the response was less than positive, and the Chinese took that to be a sign of negativity. Whereas, in fact, had they done a little speed work, they would have realized that if you include the China-Pakistan economic corridor in this project, it is a default response on the part of India. It is something that his policymakers ought to have told him.
So that's where I think the lack of scholarship or lack of serious scholarship in China would have played a part.
Yes.
Some of the older scholars would have probably told him, if he had asked, that this is not the correct way of doing it. India could have been taken on board. So 2017 onwards, when India actually opposed the BRI or the CPEC, and I think that time you were in Beijing, and then of course later you became Foreign Secretary. You were also part of the Doklam crisis and the resolution after that. Where do you see, and your paper is titled Road After Galwan. What do you think the leaders on both sides and the establishments on both sides need to do now to restore any semblance of normalcy?
I think first, of course, we need to resolve the immediate situation, and the developments of February are very welcome. I think correctly the understandings have been reduced to paper, which is important because in China the written word is the only word.
Right.
The spoken word is not something which can be trusted. So, but we have only done part of the process, and my understanding from what I read in the media is that the rest of the process of de-escalation and disengagement is underway, or disengagement and de-escalation is underway. Now, after that happens, one point which we need to underscore to the Chinese, and this has been done rather effectively by the External Affairs Minister at the India Today conclave, is that the days of sort of shelving the boundary question are over. That was part of a larger agreement which Rajiv Gandhi reached with Deng Xiaoping, that if we shelve the problem, we also deal with the small issues arising on the line of actual control to maintain peace in that area.
Right.
That obviously went out of the window over the last few years, and certainly in 2020, and therefore the message is you can't keep part of the agreement or understanding which suits you and eject something which doesn't.
Sure.
So the message that I think has been delivered by the External Affairs Minister and a number of others is that the boundary question will now be, if not front and center in the relationship, but certainly one of the important components.
And it will be linked to the larger relationship.
And it will be linked to the larger relationship. And I have also seen a recent statement by the Chinese Foreign Minister where he says, let us put it in a proper place, which I am not sure is the same thing as what we are saying. But I think that is critical for us to move forward. But beyond that, of course, there are a number of issues which need to be resolved, and one I do want to stress upon is the trade issue.
Right.
You know, we've had a trade deficit growing from $21 billion to $50 billion, and in India it is no longer a statistical problem. It's not a number anymore.
Sure.
It's a political problem.
Right.
Because it involves jobs, it involves investment, it involves people. The Chinese don't understand this. They still think that this is a statistic which can be dealt with by saying, I will send a buying mission, or we will buy more sugar, or we will buy more rice. But we are looking at it as a political problem with a sustainable resolution. That is again an issue they must tackle soon, because scolding us for shutting down some apps or stopping certain imports is a response to what has happened. It is not policy.
No.
It is reaction.
Right.
And that reaction needs to be understood.
Exactly. In fact, one of the things that the Chinese would probably be very prickly about is also the Quad.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned in your discussion on the Carnegie paper with the Carnegie Fellows, where you said that India needs to convince China that this is not Asian NATO.
Yes.
Explain that a little bit.
Yes. Well, I don't know whether we can convince China, but what we do need to do is convince the rest of the Indo-Pacific community, first of all, that Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is a vision that India has for its own external and internal security, which for a large part has nothing to do with China.
Right.
Port connectivity, coastal shipping, protection of the exclusive economic zone, protecting our energy routes from the Straits of Hormuz to the Indian mainland, and so on. The Quad is only a platform,
Right.
as indeed are other platforms, including Russia, India, China, or
BRICS. Yeah.
and the two are
Or even SCO.
or even SCO. So the two are separate. Now, China obviously has an interest in conflating it because they have concerns with Quad. We have to also recognize that they have concerns. Rightly or wrongly, they think the United States is out to contain them and that the rest of us are aiding or abetting in that process.
Sure.
So it is in that context that I meant that we have to convince China that we are an independent power. We are not simply an attachment to any other country, which will automatically do what that country says. And the fact that for 50 years we have not become an ally, and the fact that we defied the Americans in 1974 on the nuclear tests with all the pain that went with it, and in 1998 on the nuclear tests with all the pain that went with it,
Yes.
should convince them that we are hardly likely to become an attachment when we are actually more powerful than we were at those times.
Exactly.
But it's going to be difficult to convince because of this mistrust factor.
Right.
So it will take a while to talk them through it. And but we have to have the dialogue.
That dialogue is extremely important.
to have it.
I think the Chinese also have got into their mind that India has abandoned its what they used to call non-alignment, or some people call strategic autonomy, by aligning very openly with the United States. Foundational agreements, now joining the Quad, or upping the Quad's resonance in the world. How does China then react to that? I mean, what will they be convinced at all? Whatever you do, they may not be able to, digest that fact.
Well, of course, firstly, I find it rather strange that a country which itself has actually aligned to one or another superpower and admits to it openly is now saying that India is aligning. I mean, in 1950, the word leaning to one side is Mao Zedong's own phrase, where he said, I'm leaning towards the Soviet Union to deal with the Americans.
Right.
And we all know that in the 1970s, the whole opening Kissinger's
Kissinger
visit was
and
because they leaned towards the United
Nixon,
States
yeah.
to defeat the Soviet Union.
Right.
So, I mean, they know a thing or two about alignment.
Leaning and alignment, yeah.
In our case, we may not be able to convince them, but I think that the key to it is not necessarily convincing them that we are aligned or not aligned. It is convincing them that we have independent interests, and that those independent interests do not necessarily harm China's interests. That our interests are not completely convergent with American interests, whatever they may be.
Sure.
Now, it's not going to be easy to do so, but I think we cannot wish away that China is a neighbor, and
Exactly.
therefore not talking to them is not an option.
And
So we talk to them, but we do what we have to secure our own national security.
exactly. And in any case, you cannot even wish away the fact that India is the only country among the Quad countries which has a contested border with China, land border.
Yes.
No other country has that. I mean, India has to deal with China bilaterally in any case. I think that, of course, is a given. But a couple of personal questions. You've been a China watcher, observer for such a long time. We've spoken about Tiananmen earlier, your experience there when you were there, the incident in 1989. So what are you working on, apart from these papers that you're doing now?
No, I'm working on 2 books actually, both on China,
Right.
And basically one on Chinese politics,
Right.
which I think is interesting, and the other on India-China relations broadly. But my objective in writing is because I felt after doing this Carnegie paper, or even before that there is very little scholarship on China in India as well.
True.
That we refer to Western scholars. And I think if I can contribute to the body of Indian writing on China, that's important. I think there are a number of very good upcoming younger scholars. And we've discussed some
Yes.
of those people.
Right.
But I suppose age and experience has some benefit.
No, of course.
So,
And memory.
and memory. So I thought I'd do that. In addition, of course, I'm teaching at 2 places. I'm teaching at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Ahmedabad and at the Symbiosis in Pune, but of course it's virtual at the moment because of the COVID,
That's
so it's
true.
all online.
I'm sure the students there are benefiting, and we will look forward to those 2 books whenever they come out, hopefully this year.
Both will come out this year, but the timing is yet.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great thing to know, because we'll eagerly look forward to your scholarship, your analysis, your complete commentary on that. On that note, let me thank you for sparing time on your visit to Delhi, short visit. But do keep in touch, and of course, we'll keep drawing on your experience and your knowledge about China, if nothing else.
Thank you, Nitin. Thanks a lot.
So, pleasure.